Everyone says real estate development is the riskiest thing you can do. Is that true?
No, it's a whole lot safer than any fix and flip just because we're able to control the product from start to finish. With a fix and flip, you're dealing with an existing house. You're always going to have some surprises. And at the end of the day, real estate development is something that is a whole lot more plannable. So I think the risk is much reduced.
Wait, so you're saying flipping is actually riskier? How come?
Absolutely. Just because you're always going to be competing with also a new construction inventory, right? A fix and flip at the end of the day is you repurposing the property. Think about the closets. Nowadays, women love large closets, but when you look at a house from 1980, you're not necessarily going to have that, and there's only so much a lot of times you can change about an existing property, right? And so with new construction, you're able to design a really attractive floor plan that you know is going to sell. You're able to really choose everything from start to finish. And so with a fix and flip, a lot of times it's just like lipstick on a pig. And I think flips are a whole lot riskier. When I flipped, so I did about 25 flips, we had definitely some home runs, but it's less predictable just because you don't necessarily know exactly whether the room sizes or whatnot are really going to sell just because you're working with the existing floor plan, right? And then also in terms of just the sizes of the houses, you can't necessarily build the property up to the highest and best use, right? As a developer, we get paid based on us bringing a property to the highest best use and maximizing the property. When you're working with a fix and flip, you can only do so much. So I actually think really fix and flips is a whole lot more risky. Also, when you open up walls, you never know what you're going to find. We literally have found everything from just rotten pipes to also even a snake behind the walls. Wow. That is a true story. I think fix and flips ultimately just are not as predictable, not as scalable. You only have one structure on a property at any given time versus with a development, new construction development or land development, you're able to build and scale. So there are just multiple benefits why I think development is so much more predictable and safer than fix and flips are.
So why do you think people perceive development as more intense than flips?
I think it's a lot of times because they don't necessarily see themselves as a developer just yet. I think it's that identity shift where it's a whole lot easier watching HGTV, seeing some cosmetic updates of, hey, let's paint this wall, let's change the vanity here, whatnot, and people see themselves being able to do that because it seems like a little bit more manageable. When in fact, actually, like when you really get into a full fix and flip, you have to think about so many more things than if you were to start truly with a blueprint from start to finish on a blank canvas, right, with a new construction development.
But we've all seen the horror stories, cost overruns, projects going sideways. Those are real, right?
Absolutely. A lot of people actually don't run the numbers on the dirt upfront. So bad feasibility, also really bad budgets. I've seen people utilizing, especially new developers, utilizing budgets from a builder, but they don't pad it. They basically don't add to it. So they have no contingencies and then also no process. So a lot of times people doing it alone, trying to figure it out, sort of trying and error. And I've been there, right? And I've paid for it. I always say you pay one way or another, either voluntarily or involuntarily. And without having a process, you're figuring out the sequence of what's next steps to take, right?
So how do you actually reduce the risk before you start building? What does that look like step by step?
Absolutely. I recommend to follow 5 steps. The first step is the feasibility study. You want to make sure that the deal generally works out on a feasibility basis, back of the napkin, right? For what we're buying the lot, does that make sense to where we're trying to sell it? Does the zoning work? Do we need to rezone it? That's just like all the initial feasibility study. Then step number 2, you want to have a deal scorecard. You cannot take on every deal, right? So you need to understand what deals is really worth pursuing and what deals do you say no to. And so we have one that our members use, and ultimately that just helps making the decision early rather than trying to figure it out after you went through all the steps. And then 3, it's actually the full due diligence. Now the due diligence scope, it depends a little bit on the size of the deal. It might be a quick due diligence where we have a full checklist where we just make sure that we're not missing everything, right, or anything. So you check out whether there's water on site, utilities, any stormwater retention, making sure that the topography works. You're maybe even getting a survey at that point, and also financially that it checks out, right? So we're really running the numbers based on our anticipatory budget, basically, that we're looking to do. Sometimes we have an existing floor plan, so we know the numbers already, or essentially we're coming up with preliminary numbers that we're then getting confirmed by the builder. But we're making sure that we know for a fact, okay, this deal is going to work. Because if you do need to leave the deal, then you need to leave the deal during the due diligence period. Otherwise, you're not going to get your earnest money back, right? So as I mentioned, in the due diligence period, we basically get really clear on the numbers. But then on 4, we really stress test each budget line item. And that's also where we make sure we have enough contingency, right? And then step number 5 is your team. Who's going to be on the team? Making sure that you have very vetted general contractors, so a builder. Again, as a developer, we don't necessarily always build. Sometimes we decide to go vertical. Sometimes we actually just sell after we've prepped the land. But you want to make sure that if you do go vertical, that you have a solid builder. And then also a good civil engineer. If it is a more complicated townhome development, for example, you need to make sure you have a proper engineer as well as an architect, right? That's pretty much your initial team, and then you have your lender, maybe an investor, and making sure that the incentives overall are aligned with who you're working with.
You mentioned doing deals alone is what causes problems. Can you give me a real example?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, just in January, we had a member join. At that point, she was already past the due diligence period, which, as I mentioned earlier, once you pass the due diligence period, you can't get your earnest money back. At that point, that really goes to the seller. Ultimately realized that the budget just wasn't really accurate, and that ultimately the deal just wouldn't have penciled. So you learn in real estate always very expensively if you don't have enough guidance, right? If you're trying to do it on your own. So once she joined, actually, we determined that, hey, if she was to go forward with this deal, she probably would be losing 60 to 100,000 versus now just basically losing the earnest money of 5K, right? A lot of times it's not necessarily that a deal is expensive. It is actually just you doing it by yourself because you're just winging it. You're learning as you go. And so we were able to save her over 50,000 having the guidance that she needed. I just wish she would have come in sooner. So it's just always that you learn otherwise the hard way. I think that's what people don't realize, that, yeah, sure, I know it's an investment in yourself to be with a program or be with a mentor or whatnot. But when you have a dedicated team that can help you, then you're also actually just faster in seeing results, right? And you're catching such mistakes way early. So you're not even going to lose the 5K of earnest money or whatnot. So that definitely was just a recent example. But I've seen it over and over. I've had friends also in the industry that just handed over the builder's budget versus actually coming up with a developer budget. And that way they didn't have any buffer. So when it came to it, they were short some funds and they had to basically go out, find a second lender to cover the difference. So I've seen it over and over. And also, at the end of the day, it takes a lot to pull off these projects. So you want to make sure you have the right team around you.
Mm-hmm. But what about people who say they'll just keep flipping because the numbers are smaller and it feels safer?
I think it just feels safer because you have something existing and you're trying to improve it. So you already feel like you're somewhat ahead and you're just going to cosmetically update it, right? But you'll always have a ceiling. You're never able to build in some economy of scale where, for example, with a new development, you buy land, right, and ideally even get a discount, so you already have built-in equity. And then now you can build, let's just say, 2, 3, 5, 10 townhomes, right? And you're making basically a whole lot more by just having essentially the same time invested, where you come up with one floor plan, maybe you then mirror it, right? And all of a sudden now you're making $500,000 to $1 million versus your 30 to 50K out of flip, and you're running all over town, kind of rinse repeating a flip, where every single time every flip is different, right? So I think it's just the perceived safety by working with something that's existing. But when you really think it through, again, you're working with existing floor plans that might not be ideal to your ideal buyers. I think that there's a whole lot more risk in those flips just because you're not able to have the planability and the scalability with development.
So what would you tell someone who's been watching YouTube videos and development for years but still haven't made a move?
That's one of my favorite questions because I think that's the most expensive education that there is. Watching YouTube content or Instagram content for 3 years and not having closed on a deal, that is the single most expensive education that there is. Because at the end of the day, you still haven't made a move, you haven't put it into action. So what I would tell anybody that is really consuming a lot of content, start by actually identifying deals, right? It starts with skill set. Now you've watched YouTube and hopefully know at least a little bit something there, but you gotta find a deal. If you're still not able to find a deal, identify a deal, then you're still stuck in that limbo of trying to learn more, right? But once you're actively analyzing deals, then capital will follow and you're able to find and complete your deal. So I think anybody that's watched content for extended period of time, but still doesn't feel like they can identify a deal, that's what you need to solve for. You need to solve for really getting started with actual deals by looking at them and evaluating them.
how did you make your first deal? I know you came from Germany with no credit and no network, so how did you get started?
I did not even start by watching YouTube videos because it didn't really exist at the time. I started in 2017. Like I said, I flipped a bunch of property, but I started with literally no credit, no network. My family still lives in Germany, and I had to really hack everything from building credit to building a network and learning this. So it was all trial and error, and quite frankly, it cost me a whole lot. Yeah, that was definitely the most expensive way of starting. The way I did my first deal, though, was through basically pairing two investors. So a guy that I formerly worked with in New York City, he became one of my investors. And then locally, I met another investor that basically said, hey, if you find another investor, then I'll invest with you. And so I paired them up for $175,000 each, so I had 250. And then basically what we did is we bought land for 250, and that other 100 was reserved for interest carry, paying, for example, some soft costs like architect and surveyor. And because I didn't have the credit, I wasn't enough bankable, we actually ended up paying one investor a little bit more to co-sign on the loan. So I did the first deal without any kind of capital of my own and no credit of my own. Here in the US, you can do a whole lot working through LLCs, and that's something too that I help a lot of people with now. There are the shortcuts, if you will, to doing your first deal. And quite frankly, there are even more other ways to do your first deal. This is just one example of like how I did my first, but it's definitely a method that works super well. It's just that I've seen in retrospect that I was just going for it. I didn't have fear. I just was like, okay, hey, I want to stay in the US, flipping doesn't count as a business. Okay, what else can I do to create original value here in real estate? Okay, new construction, let's do it. And yeah, so that was the journey.
So you starting without YouTube videos, without anything to look at, was that not terrifying for you?
I wish I would have had a mentor in retrospect, for sure, because I think I could have saved myself easily 50 to 100K just in the very beginning there, because we had a really rough experience with the builder. So we ended up paying on top there. So that was like after the build was done, the guy basically just didn't show up anymore. And I wish I would have protected ourselves more in the front end. So there were definitely some lessons learned. We still made 250,000 on that deal, but I think we could have actually made probably 350 or something if we would have been more cautious on like how the contract was drafted and whatnot. So was it terrifying? Not necessarily terrifying, just because I was like, okay, hey, I'm either going to figure this out or I'm going to go home. So, but I just had to execute. But I can see how it is terrifying to people. That's why I think, yeah, if you have a blueprint that you know will work, then I would always choose that for sure than doing what I did.
So what about the people watching this who have families, who cannot afford to take a big risk at the moment?
I think start small, right? We've had a few members like just doing the side deals while still working a 9 to 5. Mario right now in the academy, he's working actively on a deal and is still working a full job as a civil engineer. So I think you can still do that, right? And now you have your income and you're stacking your pipeline to obviously then make a whole lot more with your developments. So I think that's a great way to start. It's just how bad do you want it, how you're willing to put in the work. As long as you really are open to grind and to hustle, you'll ultimately work yourself out of that 9 to 5 job and then have your freedom there with your development pipeline and executing your own deals. So I think it's just more that people think, oh, there's this perfect time, and then when I finish this, then I'm going to get to that. There is no perfect time. There's never a better time to start than now. You just have to be willing to commit that, yes, for a little bit of time, it will be a lot of work and it will be long hours, but anything worth having doesn't come easy.
Last question. If someone is watching this and they are on the fence about development, what's the one thing you would tell them?
It changes your life entirely. It changed mine. Without development, I wouldn't even be here in the US still. And just the amount of money that I've been able to make over the years is life-changing. Yes, of course, it's going to be a roller coaster to a certain extent, especially I've done everything on my own. So I've been through trial and error and fire. But that's why I also started the academy. That's why I'm so passionate about taking other people along. But the development side is just the peak of the real estate hierarchy. So with that, you really can do anything else in real estate so much easier. And you're in full control. So at the end of the day, you're able to build whatever you want it to be. And like I said, I really love helping other people come along. And I have a roadmap that people can download, and ultimately that at least gives them the starting point and shows them the steps of what to do when, just to execute their first deal.